Oh, hello. You must be here to learn about the ancient language. Well, let's get started. Hi, my name's Alex Butterfield. Been in the games industry for almost 2 decades now, and I've worked on too many games to list, primarily as a designer, but also as a coder, and I'm currently a technical designer at Team Wibby, where amongst other things I have had the great privilege and enormous fun of working on the ancient language, creating that from scratch and integrating it into the game. You can see some of the symbols from the ancient language in this amazing poster for the game made by the incredibly talented Dan Mumford. Phantom Abyss launched in early access in June with little upfront story, but with a wealth of symbols from our fictional lost civilization carved into panels and onto objects found throughout the game's temples. A community of dedicated players worked together to hunt down all of the panels and bit by bit unlock the secrets of the language. In the space of just 2 weeks, players wrote over 10,000 messages discussing the translations on the game's ancient language Discord channel. They built their own translation tools and a website to help others learn the language. And they pieced together the detailed backstory of our game to share with Phantom Abyss's broader audience. In doing so, they became a part of the game's story. To this day, players are still discussing and refining their translations of some of the more complex symbols and the more obscure sentences in the story. At the time I'm recording this talk, 10 weeks after launch, the channel is now up to 18,000 messages, with players eagerly awaiting the next language update. This talk, which I've titled Giving Life to a Dead Language, a Unique Approach to World Building, will cover the careful design steps we took to ensure the language would be engaging and solvable, but require still a considerable group effort to crack. But I'm jumping ahead. The origins of this ancient language lie almost 24 years ago, with a young me sitting at the back of a particularly dull electrical engineering lecture at uni. On my pad I was scribbling, and it was just a pad, not an iPad back then, I was scribbling symbols from the game Riven, which I had been playing in the evenings with my friends. We knew it was a number system, but we needed to understand the pattern behind it. I turned my pad 90 degrees and suddenly everything just clicked into place, and I had the most wonderful and exhilarating aha moment. And it was all I could do to contain my excitement during that lecture, and then rush back to my friends to tell them what I'd worked out. And from that moment, I knew that I wanted to make not just a number system, but an entire language for players to solve as a game. Like, I could see how fun that would be. Fast forward to 2019 when Inkle released Heaven's Vault. John Ingold beat me to it. It took too long. I mean, I had a 24-year head start, so, fair game to him. But, over the years, there's been quite a few times I've had an idea that I'm really passionate about and someone else has made, and it's usually, I get this feeling of relief, like I don't have to make it anymore. Fantastic. It exists. Someone else did the hard work. But in spite of Heaven's Vault being a fantastic game, I still had this burning desire to create this language. And it's something that I'd talked with various colleagues about in previous jobs, and I talked at length to Josh Sanderson, the technical lead at Team Wibby, about it. He's also a co-founder of the company. He was the one who twigged to the potential for Phantom Abyss, and he encouraged me to pitch it to the rest of Team Wibby, which I did. And initially they contracted me for 2 weeks to build out the core language and the story, but I came on later as a full-time contractor, and now they can't get rid of me. By launch, I'd spent about 6 weeks on the story and the language, and I'm hoping to spend at least as much time again expanding the language and writing more symbols and more chapters in the story over the course of early access development. While I've been talking, some of you have probably been noticing patterns in the ancient language title on this slide. Maybe you've even been trying to translate it. And before I flick to the next slide, I want to quickly talk a little about the sentence you can see here. As with all translations in this talk, I will use the player's current agreed meaning, not my own original one. I want to minimize my influence on their interpretation of the game text, and honestly, they're pretty close. There's not much that is significantly different. Yeah, it's not word for word to English for a number of reasons, but primarily because the ancient language is Idiographic. I'll talk more about that later. But the title you see here roughly translates to giving to an ancient language that's dead life or birth, a path or crossing that's rare to the work of earth. There are two other noteworthy things about the sentence you can see here. That third symbol on the first line is the symbol for the ancient language, and it was made by the players based off the language's radicals, which I'll also talk more about later. And it's the first time I've used it in an official capacity. It's also the first time I've ever written a sentence in this language that doesn't start with a noun. It seems that writing a talk title requires different sentence structures than those used by kings and poets engraving temple walls. This talk obviously is about Conlangs. Conlang is a portmanteau of constructed language, and there's a lot of them. It turns out humans quite like making up languages. The difference between a constructed language and a natural language, such as English, is that the latter evolves over a long time, shaped by the idiosyncrasies of those who use it and the practical considerations of writing and speaking it in everyday life. Due to the wide reach of entertainment these days, most people have heard of such conlangs as Klingon, Dothraki, and Sindarin. But some noteworthy conlangs outside of entertainment are lingua ignota. That was the earliest documented conlang, and it was created by a Benedictine abbess called Hildegard von Bingen, who was a fascinating historical polymath, a good 350 years before Da Vinci made that call. I strongly recommend people look her up. She's really interesting. Another example is Toki Pona, literally good talk. It's a relatively recent example created by Canadian linguist and translator Sonia Lang. With the goals of minimalism to simplify thoughts and communication, it has just 120 basic words, and that symbol you can see up in the top right, that is the symbol for the language. Ithkuil is an experimental language created by DMV employee John Chiada in 1978 and refined over multiple decades before he initially published it in 2004. Almost the polar opposite of Toki Pona, Ithkuil's goal is to allow the highest possible degree of logic, efficiency, detail, and accuracy in cognitive expression. Of course, that's not the most practical thing necessarily if you go too far down that tunnel, and it actually takes even the language's creator minutes with a reference manual to construct a single word. Examples of conlangs in games are harder to come by, presumably because of the time investment required. Sometimes the developers decide that only the feeling of a language is necessary and settle for a simple substitution cipher, as is the case in Breath of the Wild, for instance. In fact, I'm only aware of 2 games that revolve around learning a constructed language, and they're both made by small indie developers. So the first is Heaven's Vault, which I mentioned before, developed by Inkle Studios and released in 2019. It's a remarkable game that really captures the feel of archaeology and of rediscovering the secrets of a lost language and indeed an entire lost culture and history. The second is Sethian, developed by Grant Kuning and released in 2016. That's an intriguing approach to a conlang game in which you communicate with an AI using the language, though ultimately it confounded me as a player, and that's probably a sign that it wasn't accessible enough to the general public, as I'm pretty crazy about these things and I really wanted to get deeper into it. Lastly, I'll mention Riven, the inspiration for me personally in wanting to get into conlangs. The number system was just part of the greater Dani language. However, unlike Heaven's Vault or Sethian, the game wasn't designed to help you learn the language. Indeed, it seems a large portion of what fans have translated of the Dani language is from correspondence with Richard A. Watson, who was Cyan's lawmaster. So, what's particularly unique about our approach? For Phantom Abyss, we wanted to do something a little different. Our aim was to create a language that, like Riven, was in the background. After all, most of our players have come to run through temples dodging traps and guardians, not stare at walls translating an ancient language. So it needed to not be a block to what people were doing in the game. Like Heaven's Vault, we also wanted the language to be solvable without our assistance, but we also wanted to create it in such a way that the community would need to work together, more like an augmented reality game. Most notably, unlike the games on the previous slide, the game doesn't verify your translation, and I do not plan to confirm or deny any player's theories. Indeed, this may be unique outside of real-world efforts to translate lost languages. Nor does our game provide the tools to help players solve the language alone. Heaven's Vault did. Indeed, it's an integral part of playing the game. And so there was less need for community cooperation, and you can see that in the community that forms around the language. We've generated more messages in our language Discord channel in just 2.5 months than they have in 2.5 years. So, instead of confirming players' individual translations for words and for the story, I consider the fans' agreed translations to be canon. Why? What were our long-term goals here? We wanted to hint at a lost culture, a long-lost culture, with broad strokes painting a clear sense of the identity of the civilization that built the temples, and suggestions of rich details to excite players' imaginations. We wanted to encourage community cooperation. This is something you'll see in the many design choices throughout Phantom Abyss, and the language is no exception. We wanted to involve the community in the story. By making the players the ones who agree on the translations, they become the keepers of the lore, a part of the unfolding story themselves. And that was the primary reason for the fan translation being canon. We wanted to evoke an emotional reaction. The backstory of Phantom Abyss is a tragedy of enormous magnitude, the tale of one man's obsession with immortality destroying an entire civilization. We wanted to build a language for the players, one that they can use to read story panels in the game, but also to communicate in simple sentences with each other if they choose. And we wanted to inspire the players, both to get creative with the ancient language and hopefully their own creations too, much as Riven inspired me. So how did we do on those 6 goals? I'll circle back to that at the end of the talk. So, I want to talk a bit about the anatomy of our language. It is, and I'll explain each of these terms in depth shortly, logographic, pictographic, mostly, idiographic, and the symbols contain radicals, and it's read left to right, like most languages, including English, not right to left, which is more common in Middle Eastern languages. But it compounds right to left, unlike English, which compounds left to right. So in English, you would say football. In our ancient language, you would say ball foot. The pictures here show how the anatomy of the language directly affects how players interact with it. The top picture is an example sentence constructed by Clockwise, one of our players, in the detailed grammar primer that he wrote to help those unfamiliar with the language. The bottom picture was Wilco, another player, using radicals from existing symbols to construct a new symbol. Now, spoiler alert here, I will need a symbol that means exactly that in a later part of the story, and with one minor exception, he's pretty much nailed what it's going to look like by understanding the basic rules of the language. So, on to explaining each of those terms I threw around before. Our language is logographic. Now, what logographic means is that each symbol is an entire word. Examples of this include Chinese, Hanzi characters, which you can see in the example here. Mayan languages, of which there were many, and which were a significant part of the inspiration for this language also, and cuneiform. The alternatives to logographic languages are syllabic and alphabetic. Syllabic means each symbol is a syllable. Examples of this include Japanese, the hiragana and katakana characters, Cherokee. An interesting fact about this is that the Cherokee syllabary was invented by a Cherokee named Sequoyah in the early 1800s. Before this, it was only a spoken language, and as Sequoyah could neither read nor write any other language, he became what we would consider literate, not through learning, but through the invention and spreading of that syllabary for the language he already spoke. And another example of a syllabic language is Linear B, which was a Bronze Age script long forgotten that was only recently translated in 1952 by self-taught philologist Michael Ventris. So someone doing exactly what the players in our game did to translate our language, but with a real-life ancient language that had been lost. Now, the last type of language is alphabetic, and that's the one that you're presumably most familiar with. That means each symbol is a letter, so it includes English, German, and all of the Romance languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, etc. So that is the three different ways that languages can be expressed in their symbols. Next up, language is mostly pictographic. So pictographic symbols look like what they mean. Many of the words in our language are partially or wholly pictographic. Take the 6 examples I've got here. Light shines from an orb, presumably the sun. Darkness covers that orb. Fire is a stylized swirl sitting on a flat line that represents the ground, while plant is the inversion of that swirl, sprouting from the same base line. Thorns are curved barbs on a vertical stem, while spikes are straight lines protruding from the ground. Because these symbols look like what they mean, it was much easier for players to agree on translations for them. Pictographic symbols are great for things you physically find in the world, but not so good for actions, adjectives, and abstract concepts. So the opposite of a pictographic symbol is an abstract symbol, which means they don't look like what they mean. They don't look like anything. I tried to avoid completely abstract symbols, and those familiar with the radicals in the language will probably argue that of my examples here, unchanged still is not abstract. The arrows are used in movement, and all arrows pointing at the center is suggestive of not moving. Similarly, the symbols, the elements of the symbol that the community is tentatively treating as secret have significant meaning as well. A dot generally denotes a living sentient thing. Here, 2 are separated by a radical found in the symbol for key, etc. One thing is clear, however. These are all fairly infrequently used symbols in the game's ancient language panels, but the more abstract the symbol, the less certain the community is of the meaning. Next up, I said that the language was idiographic. Now, idiographic symbols represent a whole concept and rely on the context within a sentence to derive a precise meaning. For example, the symbol for blade in the ancient language is used here as a noun, an adjective, and a verb to say the sharp blade cuts. I couldn't find an exact term that describes the opposite of idiographic, and perhaps a trained linguist can correct me, but I settled on calling them semantic. So semantic symbols, as I'm calling them here, represent a specific, often nuanced meaning and are misleading or wrong if they're used outside the context appropriate to that meaning. Looking at the bottom picture, it doesn't matter if you can read Portuguese. A red octagon with a white border means just one thing: stop. And it means that almost anywhere in the world. But perhaps the best way to illustrate the difference is with a symbol central to Phantom Abyss. English has the word phantom, the words phantom, spirit, ghost, spectre, shade, apparition, soul, etc. Each word has a slightly different connotation as to how it represents that concept. It wouldn't make sense to see someone's soul or to worry for their immortal phantom, for instance. In the ancient language, however, all of those meanings are contained in just a single symbol, which you can see to the right here, and also if you look closely, you'll see a stylized version of it in the closed loop of the A in the game's logo, which is up in the top left. Part of the reason we chose ideographic symbols was because I had a limited amount of time to develop the symbols and I wanted to maximize vocabulary, but equally it provides players who learn the language with a much greater range of what they can express with it. Each symbol they learn can be used many different ways. So, this one choice allowed us to tell a nuanced and tragic story with just 270 unique symbols. Next up, I said language symbols contain radicals. So in fact, they're entirely composed of radicals. So much like the Chinese Hanzi characters, radicals are subsections of a symbol that confer meaning, much like a whole symbol, except that they are atomic. Their meaning can't be further broken down, and they can be combined with other radicals to construct symbols with more complex meanings. Radicals help both to make the language, the symbols, easier to read and remember, and also to give an additional avenue of confirmation when trying to translate what a symbol means. They can be used to define a set, such as the rounded diamond that indicates an emotion, feeling, or state of mind. You can also create variations on a radical. So in the case of the rounded diamond, if it's broken, then it's a more intense emotion than if it's unbroken. Radicals don't have to be limited to sets either, as is the case with all three radicals players have identified in the symbol for immortal, which you can see in the image at the bottom. And radicals allow players to extrapolate potential symbols they haven't included, even if, as seen in the image to the right, they sometimes extrapolate a little too far. Perhaps the biggest benefit, though, to using radicals is the speed with which I've been able to add new content to the language, because I can simply pull in the related symbols, copy their vectors, delete what I don't need, rearrange it to look good, and then with a stroke, with the brush, the symbol's done. Which may sound complex, but it's far quicker than designing and drawing the new symbols from scratch. Next up, contextual direction. The ancient language is read left to right, as I said before. So, but the adjectives and adverbs compound right to left. So the example I gave was football would be ball foot. Given the need to jump back and forth to read the ancient language aloud as English, we made the tense markers, the accusative marker and conjunctions half-width to clearly separate sections of text that are read backwards. The screenshot to the right shows when one of the players first worked out this order of the symbols should be read in, whilst the image below is a refined example of reading adverbs from Clockwise's grammar breakdown. To read this aloud, you would scan to the half-width characters and then read backwards from the next half-width character, or in this case, the end of the line. So this would read, "A king should not fearfully rule." Why did I choose to complicate things and not just make it scan the same as English? Well, I would argue I didn't. It's English that makes things complicated. But also, there are many languages that don't compound their adjectives and adverbs left to right. And even English has enough exceptions that compound right to left, that they have a name. They're called post-positive adjectives. But also, I just think it's silly to start reading the description of a thing before you know what it is. Like, it's one of a number of great big glaring, not so wonderful, ragged-edged design flaws in English. And if I'm going to make a new language from scratch, why not make it better? So far I've talked a lot about the structure of the language's symbols and grammar and why we made the choices we did, but there's an equally important aspect to the design that is completely hidden from view. I needed to be sure that players had enough to confidently translate most of the symbols in the language if they had any hope of translating the story spread over the 27 panels in the hub. To do this, players first needed entry points. In cryptography, these are called cribs. By integrating the language into the world and into the user interface, we were able to give the players a lot of symbols they could infer the meaning of purely from context. Many traps are labelled, along with chests, keys, doors, some relics, etc. Most screens in the user interface contain symbols as well. And there's even symbols for every whip and blessing. And the more pictographic a symbol is, the more reliably it can be used as a crib too. Note the image to the right. Oh no, it's to the left now. I changed this slide. Note the image to the left, where not only is there a symbol for lightning on the lightning whip, which has radicals suggesting light coming down from a cloud, but also the shine particles on valuable items that have the same shape as the symbol for shine. Ultimately allowing the player to crack the name, you can see on the bottom left as the Shining King. From the entry points, I built out the poem panels specifically to help define more complex terms. There are 67 poem panels in total, and each is intended to give context or a straight-up definition of at least one new word. Collectively, they are carefully designed set of stepping stones, allowing players to confirm inferences and grow their vocabulary. They are also a great opportunity to flesh out the character of the poet and get philosophical. And as you progress through the numbered poems, the poet grows increasingly cynical and critical of the king. I've talked at length about patterns already, both through consistent use of radicals and through defining sets of related words. These give important additional points of reference and further fuel for theories when a player thinks they've worked out what a particular word means. The concept of a learning tree is not so concrete that I ever physically mapped it out, but it was very important to this approach too. I basically strictly ensured that every new word I added needed to either be inferable from context, as with the things I already discussed, labels on traps, user interface, etc., or it needed to be able to be defined in a poem using only existing words. And by doing that, I guaranteed that even if I had to create some interim steps, any new symbol was always going to be eventually able to be deduced with relative certainty by the players. With the amount of time I spent building the language, it was important that it didn't give up its secrets too fast. So we also took a couple of steps to slow players down. Firstly, we hid the poem panels in nooks around the randomly generated temples so that players would have to search for them while playing the game. However, they're reasonably common, and with lots of players helping out, it took less than 2 days for the players to gather screenshots of all 67. Secondly, there are some symbols that do not have a direct equivalent in English, nor possibly in most other languages, either because they break out a meaning usually given by variation of a word, such as the use of tense markers instead of conjugated verbs, or because they use one symbol in more than one context, such as the symbol for grow, which can also be used to indicate a progressive transition between two states. And finally, I intentionally used just a handful of symbols in too few places for the players to be certain of their meanings. I had hoped people would form different camps and have long discussions back and forth about why the symbol might mean one thing or another, but in fact the players, too smart for that, they were quick to spot those symbols that had too little context, and they generally just agreed that there wasn't enough to go on and left them as either unknown or had in the final agreed translation like opposing theories just side by side and flagged it as disputed. Also, I needn't have bothered creating intentionally ambiguous symbols, it turned out, because across the 270 symbols used in the story and poems, there were enough unintentional cases of ambiguity, and these were generally more debated because they were not obviously intentional. Did these attempts to slow the players down work? No, not really. They still cracked the language several times faster than I'd anticipated, and they're hungry for more ancient language content. In fact, they'll consume it faster than I can possibly make it. Another factor to consider in any attempt to obfuscate content from the players is that some are very literate in how to decompile your game and strip out assets. As a general rule, players in the ancient language channel agreed they wouldn't do that. They didn't want to spoiler things. They didn't want to find things out the way they weren't meant to, and only intentionally went in and ripped assets after they'd found the relevant information and translated it to their confidence. But even with the care that they were taking, there was still a couple of accidents. When they went in to grab the font, the guy who did that noticed the order the numbers appeared in the font and realized that the players had made an error about the way the number sequence worked. And the other one that happened was when they went to pull the poem strings, they were in an asset that I'd called poem strings. So that unfortunately settled an argument that had been ongoing about whether the poet was a poet or a priest, which you can see in the second image there, down below. So yeah, regardless of how careful the players were, accidents still happened, and I'm still not completely comfortable with the game being vulnerable to someone coming in and intentionally trolling and revealing stuff that players didn't want to know that way. So I intend to take better steps for that in future. Next up, what was our approach with the story? Well, we had a series of 27 panels telling the game's backstory. I placed them in the hub area where the players would come back and forth and see them lots so that they would be intrigued and want to learn how to read them. And once they got fluent, they would be able to read it straight off the walls. The result was 27 walls of story text telling the story that at first or second or third, probably many more glances, looked impenetrable, but which through focused effort and cooperation can be translated. There was no need to provide an extrinsic reward for this uncovering of the game's backstory, and the ability to share it with the greater community with their own reward for the players who engaged in this content. With just 270 symbols, these panels tell the tragedy of one man's ambition and hubris destroying an entire civilization. It's a tale of Shakespearean and mythic proportions, and without a single direct translation being provided for any symbol in the game, it can in theory be translated by anyone, regardless of what language they speak. Players on the game's ancient language Discord channel have already translated it into English, and I've heard there are separate attempts to translate it into Spanish, Portuguese and French as well. Just as the initial art for the game inspired and continues to inspire the storyline, it's increasingly true that the artists draw inspiration from the story when creating new assets for the game. This is becoming an increasingly tight loop, and it really helps to bring the whole game world to life and feel like a coherent whole. The current story also raises a number of questions and leaves the door open to future chapters, like what happened to the Shining Prince? Did the poet really just finish his work and quietly join his loyal pet in the afterlife? What will happen if the God of the Abyss is ever freed from his prison? This helps to generate discussion amongst the players, but it also gives me avenues to continue the story. In fact, by the time this talk comes out, 2 of those questions will have already been answered. But that will in turn lead to more questions, and there's definitely no shortage of stories that I want to tell set in the Phantom Abyss. While a backstory told this way could be no different to a regular story where there is an author and a reader and there's just a linear series of things that happen, the fact that we will not confirm the translations and that it's the player's interpretation of not just the story but the language itself, it makes the whole thing an experience, not just a story, and it adds an element of interaction, and makes it just stand out above traditional linear storytelling format. Even better, it gives the players a language with which to write their own extensions to the stories, such as the passage on the right, which players wrote about their combined efforts to solve the language. Now, obviously not everything went off without a hitch. There were a bunch of minor issues, things that didn't quite go according to plan. First up, I waited a couple of days hoping that players would organically start discussing the strange symbols. That didn't happen. I mean, maybe it did, but it wasn't happening in a public place where everyone could join in. So I ended up prompting the mods on our Discord server to add the channel, and as soon as we did that, players just leapt on it and it became a really popular channel almost immediately. I already mentioned the danger of players ripping files from the game and ruining the language. I might even go so far as to encrypt them in future. Maybe not. That's a lot of extra work. one of the things I was worried about was that players would mistake artistic details in textures that weren't meant to be symbols for symbols, like the example in the dragon head to the right. Looks like it could be a symbol, but it's not. But they pretty much straight up 100% could tell what was meant to be a symbol and what wasn't, and didn't end up causing any confusion at all. One of the areas that could have been misleading was where I used the symbols in the names of the levels, which are just randomly based off the seed that generated the temple. Yeah, they didn't get distracted by that either. And I'm actually a little bit sorry about that, because some of them are hilarious if you translate them literally. The example I've got here is the common temple of colourfully chaotic gas bomb worship. Now, next up, communication is complicated, obviously. The grammar for the language evolved as my storytelling needs evolved as I was writing the story and poem panels, and it wasn't until after release that I realised the absence of prepositions made the language ambiguous when describing certain things. So, I mean, every language has ambiguity. An oft-quoted English example is, I rode a black horse in red pyjamas. Am I wearing the red pyjamas? Is the horse wearing the red pyjamas? You're only going to know because we know that horses don't wear pyjamas. But if you didn't know that, it would be very unclear from that sentence. Regardless, I don't want that kind of ambiguity in my language, so I'm looking at adding prepositions right now as I'm working on this talk, actually. Next up, there were a few persistent misinterpretations, and given my determination not to interfere and confirm or deny things, I just had to sit there and swallow it. For several days, there was a presiding theory based on a mistranslation that the gods had come from a lake on the moon. And thankfully, people came to eventually translate that as the four gods crossed the darkest ocean. And I will neither confirm nor deny that that's the intended meaning, but let's just say I'm not sitting there with my head in my hands anymore. At times, another issue was people joining dots that I never intended, but that never really got out of hand. There were a few interesting theories, but people were ready to kind of jump on those if they didn't quite add up. And the final issue is that some of the players got so addicted to deciphering the language that they neglected to play the game. Now, I hope they all went and played it eventually after they finished translating it. And whilst unintentional, I don't necessarily see it as a negative. So we didn't troubleshoot that. We didn't do anything to change it because it was a very small subset of the player base who were getting that into translating the language. And truth be told, if someone else had designed this language and I was playing the game, I would have been right there alongside them, also getting distracted from the game. So, next up, what did we achieve? I promised to circle back to our 6 goals. We aim to hint at a long-lost culture, and certainly players coming to our Q&A sessions with questions about this, such as how did the poet survive so long in the temple, and what are the significance of all the snake and dragon heads, both of which are questions I plan to answer in future additions to the ancient language story panels. So I'm going to say we did okay on that. Pretty good. 2 out of 3 stars if I had to award star system. We also aim to encourage community cooperation. That's definitely a 3-star. Like the amount of community coming together and discussing and working out and nailing everything down was, beyond even my expectations. We wanted to make community a part of the unfolding story. Again, 3 stars. By remaining hands-off and not interfering during the translation, we let the players make their own interpretation of the story and enjoy being the Daniel Jacksons of the Phantom Abyss community. Number 4, we wanted to evoke an emotional reaction. There's areas where we definitely managed that. You can see the image on the right. The story is sad. It's not that absolute gut punch that maybe would be good and a bit easier to get with a more nuanced language. But I think part of the problem there was that the story was very mythic and grand in its scope. So in future chapters, I'm going to pull in much closer, get to know the individual characters a little bit better as you read the story, and then hopefully the players will get more attached to them and feel the emotional beats of when I George R.R. Martin them. And yeah, for the moment, I'm going to say probably only 1 star there. Number 5, many of the contributors in Ancient Language channel are now able to read the language without reference, which is great. And you can see that in Hemogoblin's comment there. And players are also keen to communicate in the language, but in spite of its relative simplicity compared to English, it's still complex to get grammatically correct. Even I struggle with this, and it's hard to say what you want to say with such a limited vocabulary as well. So I'd say 1.5 stars here. But this one may be impossible to get a 3 on. You know, we're talking a second language that people aren't going to speak in their everyday, or aren't going to use in their everyday communications. And they're learning it from a handful of examples on the walls in the background of a game. Now, lastly, number 6, I've seen some strong cases of the game inspiring players, and certainly they were inspired to solve the language, as you can see in Wilco's comment there, but also players were very much inspired to get creative with the language and to maybe even create their own languages, which is awesome. This is definitely 3 stars, and I look forward to hopefully one day watching someone's talk about a Conlang in their own game that was inspired by Phantom Abyss in the same way that I was inspired by Riven. Now, next up, what about the community reaction? So, how was the Ancient Language received? Very well. I've got a bunch of examples on this screen of different responses. You can see the number of notifications I was getting every morning when I woke up in the initial stages of people translating the game. 824 new messages, just for reference, takes quite a long time to read through, and then by the time I'd read through it, there'd be another 300 messages to get through, and by the time I'd read that, etc. So it became quite a time sink just to keep up with it, but I ultimately read every single one of the messages, 18,000 plus messages that are in the Ancient Language channel. So as Sneaky Anon has observed here, and I'll just straight up quote him because I think it's a great quote, "This group of devout people have ripped apart and put back together lines and shapes on walls, and now we have this. That's pretty impressive." And then the rest of the examples on here are some of the cooler moments that I screenshotted as I was reading them. First up on the left, we have a riddle constructed by Clockwise to help solve one of the holdout mystery symbols. He made it by combining all of the lines in which the symbol appeared translated, but with the mystery symbol replaced with the word "it." I thought this was a brilliant way to hone in on the meaning, but the greatest irony, which had me in stitches at the time, is that the symbol means I or me, so the riddle is unintentionally its own solution. Pretty quickly, people started combining the language with memes. So there's a loss meme that you might recognize there just from the shape of it. And below that is a rickroll. Then the language and the real world started blurring together, with players making up symbols that imitated the real world and even starting to see symbols everywhere outside of the game. We've had players asking questions in the Q&A channel using the Ancient Language. Others contorting their hands to make arguments for or against a symbol's interpretation, and even using symbols to make emoji, I guess emoticons probably. Anyway, I found that a delightfully meta use for them. Recently, there's even been some interest in creating real-life clay tablets with player-authored Ancient Language inscriptions, and that's just on Discord. There were discussions on Reddit as well. The players built a website for learning the language, which I've included the link for at the bottom of this very crowded slide. And there was even a narrated video retelling the story. Contributing to all of the conversations were players from a wide range of backgrounds. Some brought professional skills to the table, from history and linguistics to translation and even cryptography. I got quite a few compliments, assuming I too had a professional background in at least one of these areas, but like many of the players who helped translate the language, I come from a casual interest only. So, and I can't stress this enough, if you're sitting out there thinking you're not qualified, you are. If you like patterns and like kind of looking into things and meanings and how everything fits together, you already have all of the skills that you need to make your own Conlang. You're just as qualified as me. I'm not sure how questions are going to work with this pre-recorded format, but if you don't get the chance to ask me during GCAP, feel free to reach out and ask me any questions you want via one of the following contact methods. Like the monkey in this image, it will give me soul happiness. So, thanks.